Before we sail together across the Atlantic to the mysterious shores of Roanoke Island in the year 1584, I want to take a moment to connect with you. If you found your way here tonight, you might be seeking solace from a restless mind, a gentle escape from the day's worries, or simply a calming voice to guide you toward peaceful sleep. Whatever has brought you to this quiet corner of history, know that you are truly welcome here. Take a deep breath with me now and let yourself settle into this space. Tonight's journey will be one of mystery and wonder, but always gentle, always safe. We'll explore together the haunting tale of America's first lost colony, but we'll do so with the soft rhythm of storytelling meant to ease you toward rest. If this peaceful exploration into history helps you find the calm you're seeking, I gently invite you to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community of nighttime wanderers. Your support helps us continue creating these soothing journeys into the past, these quiet escapes that we can share together in the gentle hours before sleep. Part 1. Seeds of Ambition. The year is 1584, and the salt air carries whispers of possibility across the Atlantic. In the court of Queen Elizabeth I, a dream is taking shape, a dream of English settlement in the New World, born from the fertile imagination of Sir Walter Raleigh and nurtured by the Queen's own ambition to challenge Spanish dominance in the Americas. Raleigh, a man of extraordinary charm and vision, had already captured the Queen's favour with his wit and his poetry. Now he would capture her imagination with something far grander, the promise of a permanent English colony on the shores of what would one day be called North America. The Queen, impressed by his proposal, granted him a charter on March 25, 1584, giving him the right to explore, colonize, and govern any lands not already claimed by Christian princes. But Raleigh was no mere courtier playing at exploration. He understood that success would require careful planning, skilled leadership, and above all, knowledge of the land itself. So, in April of 1584, he dispatched 2 ships under the command of Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow on a reconnaissance mission to the coast of what is now North Carolina. The expedition that summer would prove pivotal. Amadas and Barlow, following the trade winds in the Gulf Stream, made landfall in July near what we now know as the Outer Banks. Their reports, preserved in the colonial records, paint a picture of a land of extraordinary beauty and abundance. Barlow wrote with an almost poetic enthusiasm about the goodliest land under the cope of heaven, describing forests thick with cedar, cypress, and sassafras, waters teeming with fish, and soil so fertile that vines grew wild and heavy with grapes. More importantly, they made contact with the indigenous peoples of the region, the Algonquian-speaking tribes who had called this land home for countless generations. The encounters, at least as recorded in the English accounts, were marked by curiosity and cautious friendship. 2 Native Americans, Manteo and Wanchese, were persuaded to return to England with the expedition, where they would serve as both ambassadors and sources of invaluable knowledge about their homeland. When the ships returned to England in September 1584, they brought more than just reports and passengers. They carried with them samples of the New World's bounty, tobacco, pearls, animal pelts, and most significantly, stories that would fuel English imagination for generations. Raleigh, ever the showman, presented these treasures to Queen Elizabeth, who was so pleased with the venture that she knighted him and allowed him to name the new territory Virginia in her honour, the Virgin Queen. But beneath the pageantry and excitement, more practical considerations were at work. The Spanish treasure fleets that regularly sailed from the Caribbean represented an almost irresistible target for English privateers. A permanent base on the North American coast would provide an ideal staging ground for such operations, while also serving as a potential refuge for English ships in distress. The economic and strategic value of such a settlement was not lost on Raleigh or his investors. Through the winter of 1584 to 1585, Preparations began in earnest for a more substantial expedition. Raleigh assembled a formidable team of collaborators. Richard Grenville, his cousin and a skilled naval commander, would lead the expedition. Ralph Lane, a veteran of the Irish Wars, would serve as governor of the colony, and Thomas Harriot, a brilliant mathematician and natural philosopher, would document the land and its people with scientific precision. The indigenous knowledge brought by Manteo and Wanchese proved invaluable during these preparations. Through careful questioning and observation, the English learned about the seasonal patterns of the region, the locations of fresh water sources, the nature of local agriculture, and the complex political relationships between different tribal groups. This information would prove crucial in the months to come, though not always in ways the English anticipated. By early 1585, the expedition was ready. 7 ships carrying over 600 men prepared to depart from Plymouth, their holds filled with supplies, weapons, and the hopes of a nation eager to establish its presence in the New World. The fleet included not just soldiers and sailors, but also craftsmen, artists, and scientists, men chosen to create not merely a military outpost, but a true settlement that could support itself and grow. As the ships prepared to sail, Raleigh remained behind in England, his responsibilities at court preventing him from joining the expedition personally. This decision, born of practical necessity, would prove to be one of the many factors that complicated the venture. The colonists would be operating thousands of miles from their patron, dependent on supply ships and communications that could take months to traverse the Atlantic. The departure, when it finally came in April 1585, was marked by both ceremony and uncertainty. The colonists were venturing into a world that remained largely unknown to European minds, guided only by the reports of a single previous expedition and the knowledge of 2 Native Americans who had been away from their homeland for nearly a year. They carried with them the accumulated wisdom of centuries of English experience, but they were entering a land where that wisdom would be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The Atlantic crossing, following the well-established route through the Caribbean, took several months. The ships made stops in the West Indies, where Grenville engaged in the kind of privateering that had made him famous and wealthy. These activities, while profitable, also delayed the expedition and consumed supplies that had been intended for the colony. By the time the fleet reached the Outer Banks in late June 1585, the season for establishing a settlement was already well advanced. What awaited them on the shores of Roanoke Island was a landscape both beautiful and challenging. The island itself, roughly 12 miles long and 3 miles wide, was covered in dense forests and surrounded by the shallow, shifting waters of the Sounds. The location offered certain advantages. It was defensible, had access to fresh water, and was positioned to control the main channels through the Outer Banks. But it also presented significant challenges that would become more apparent as the months passed. The indigenous inhabitants of the region, led by a chief named Wingener, initially welcomed the English with the same cautious hospitality that had marked the earlier encounters. The CROATOAN and CROATOAN peoples who lived in the area had their own complex political and economic systems, and they viewed the English arrival through the lens of their own strategic interests. Some saw opportunities for trade and alliance, others harboured deeper suspicions about the newcomers' true intentions. As the colonists began the work of establishing their settlement, they faced the fundamental challenge that would define all subsequent English efforts in the region: how to create a self-sustaining community in a land where the growing seasons, the climate, and the very soil itself operated according to different rules than those they had known in England. The answers to these questions would determine not only the success of the 1585 colony, but the fate of all who would follow. Part 2. The First Attempt. The summer of 1585 brought both promise and peril to the English settlement on Roanoke Island. Ralph Lane, now installed as governor, faced the monumental task of transforming a temporary landing into a permanent colony. The 107th men under his command included soldiers, craftsmen, and gentlemen adventurers, but notably absent were the farmers and labourers who might have been better suited to the immediate challenges of frontier life. Lane himself was a man of contradictions, experienced in warfare and administration, yet perhaps too rigid in his thinking to adapt quickly to the fluid realities of colonial life. His background in the brutal campaigns of Ireland had taught him to view indigenous peoples with suspicion, and to rely heavily on military solutions to political problems. This worldview would prove increasingly problematic as the colony's relationship with the local Native American tribes evolved. The physical establishment of the settlement proceeded with typical English thoroughness. The colonists built a fort following established military principles, with earthwork walls and bastions positioned to command the surrounding water. Inside the fort they constructed barracks, workshops and storage buildings using local timber and traditional English building techniques. Archaeological evidence discovered in the 20th century suggests that the fort was substantial and well designed, a testament to the colonists' skill and determination. But the colony's survival depended on more than defensive preparations. The colonists needed to secure reliable sources of food, establish trade relationships with the indigenous peoples, and begin the slow process of learning to live in their new environment. In these crucial areas, the colony's progress was mixed at best. Thomas Harriot, the expedition's natural philosopher, proved to be one of the colony's greatest assets. Working closely with the artist John White, Harriot began a systematic study of the region's flora, fauna, and indigenous peoples. His work, later published as a brief and true report of the newfound land of Virginia, provided the most accurate and detailed description of the Carolina coast that had yet been produced. Harriot's scientific approach and his willingness to learn from Native American knowledge gave the colony access to information that would prove crucial for survival. Through Harriot's work and the continuing cooperation of Manteo, the colonists learned about local agricultural practices, medicinal plants, and seasonal patterns. They discovered that the indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated techniques for cultivating corn, beans, and squash in the sandy soils of the coastal plain. They learned about the rich fishing grounds of the sounds and the seasonal migrations of waterfowl and other game. However, knowledge alone was not enough. The colonists struggled to implement what they learned, hampered by their own preconceptions and by the fundamental differences between English and indigenous approaches to land use and resource management. The English concept of private property and permanent settlement conflicted with the more fluid, territorial arrangements of the Native American tribes, leading to misunderstandings that would have serious consequences. The relationship with Chief Wingina and his people began to deteriorate as the summer progressed. The English demands for food and supplies placed increasing strain on the indigenous communities, who were already dealing with the challenges of supporting their own populations. The colonists' inability to produce enough food for themselves meant that they remained dependent on Native American generosity, at a time when their own actions were making that generosity increasingly difficult to sustain. Religious and cultural differences further complicated the relationship. The English, convinced of the superiority of their own civilization and faith, made little effort to understand or respect indigenous spiritual practices and social structures. They viewed Native American religions as superstition and indigenous political systems as primitive, attitudes that inevitably led to conflicts and misunderstandings. As autumn approached, the colony's situation became increasingly precarious. Richard Grenville had promised to return with supplies and reinforcements, but his ships were nowhere to be seen. The colonists faced the prospect of winter with inadequate food stores and deteriorating relations with their Native American neighbours. The psychological pressure of isolation, combined with the physical challenges of frontier life, began to take its toll on morale. The winter of 1585 to 1586 tested the colonists' endurance in ways they had not anticipated. The coastal climate of North Carolina, while milder than England's, brought its own challenges. Storms and cold weather made fishing and hunting difficult, while the colonists' limited knowledge of food preservation techniques meant that supplies spoiled faster than expected. The men, many of whom had never experienced true privation, struggled with hunger and disease. Disease, in particular, became a serious problem. The colonists had brought with them the full range of European pathogens, many of which proved devastating to Native American populations who had no immunity to them. Epidemics swept through the indigenous communities, killing large numbers of people and further straining the relationship between the colonists and their hosts. The English, viewing these outbreaks through the lens of their own religious beliefs, sometimes interpreted them as divine favour for their cause, an attitude that only deepened indigenous resentment. By spring 1586, the situation had reached a crisis point. Chief Wingina, now openly hostile to the English presence, began organising other tribes in opposition to the colony. The English, their numbers reduced by disease and desertion, found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Lane, responding to the threat in the only way he knew how, organised a preemptive strike against Wingina's village. The attack, carried out in May 1586, succeeded in its immediate objective. Wingina was killed and his followers scattered. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The English had definitively burned their bridges with the indigenous peoples of the region, making any future cooperation almost impossible. The colony, already struggling to survive, had now made enemies of the very people whose knowledge and resources they most needed. The colonists' situation was further complicated by their growing realization that Grenville's promised supply fleet was not coming. Unknown to them, Grenville had indeed set sail from England with reinforcements and supplies, but his departure had been delayed by months. The colonists, facing another winter without adequate provisions and surrounded by hostile tribes, began to despair of their situation. It was at this moment of crisis that salvation appeared in an unexpected form. Sir Francis Drake, returning from a successful privateering expedition in the Caribbean, arrived off the coast of Roanoke Island in June 1586. Drake's fleet, loaded with Spanish treasure and provisioned for the long voyage home, offered the colonists a way out of their predicament. Lane and his men faced a difficult choice. They could remain on Roanoke Island and continue their struggle to establish a permanent settlement, or they could abandon the colony and return to England with Drake. The decision, when it came, reflected the colonists' exhaustion and demoralization. After barely a year in the New World, they chose to give up their grand experiment and return home. The evacuation, carried out in haste during a period of stormy weather, was chaotic and incomplete. The colonists abandoned most of their possessions and supplies, taking only what they could carry aboard Drake's ships. Most tragically, they left behind 3 men who'd been exploring the interior and who returned to find the settlement deserted. These men, whose names are lost to history, became the first of many who would simply disappear into the wilderness of the Carolina coast. The irony of the timing was not lost on later observers. Just days after Lane's evacuation, Grenville's supply fleet finally arrived at Roanoke Island. Finding the colony abandoned and the buildings empty, Grenville left a small garrison of 15 men to maintain England's claim to the territory. These men, isolated and vastly outnumbered, faced the same challenges that had defeated Lane's colony, but with even fewer resources and no hope of reinforcement. The fate of Grenville's garrison remains one of the many mysteries surrounding the Roanoke colonies. When the next English expedition arrived in 1587, they found the settlement empty and the men gone. Some evidence suggested that they had been killed by hostile Native Americans, but their bodies were never found. Like so many others who ventured into the Carolina wilderness, they had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and speculation. The failure of the 1585 colony might have ended English interest in the region, but it did not. The reports brought back by Lane, Harriot, and others, despite describing the colony's ultimate failure, also painted a picture of a land rich in resources and potential. The scientific work of Harriot and White had provided a wealth of information about the region's natural history and indigenous peoples. Most importantly, the experience had taught valuable lessons about what would be required for a successful colony. Walter Raleigh, despite the disappointment of the first colony's failure, remained committed to his vision of English settlement in Virginia. He began planning a second expedition almost immediately, this time with a different approach. Instead of a military colony dependent on supply ships from England, the new venture would be a civilian settlement designed to become self-sufficient through agriculture and trade. The colonists would include families, not just single men, and they would be equipped with the knowledge gained from the first expedition's experiences. Part 3. The City of Raleigh. The morning mist clung to the Thames as 3 ships prepared to depart from London in the spring of 1587. This time the expedition carried not just soldiers and adventurers, but families, men, women and children, who had committed themselves to creating a new life in the wilderness of Virginia. At their head stood John White, the artist who had documented the first colony so meticulously, now promoted to governor of what would be called the City of Raleigh in Virginia. White brought to his new role a unique combination of practical experience and artistic vision. His detailed watercolours of indigenous peoples and natural phenomena had already made him famous in England, but his year on Roanoke Island had also given him intimate knowledge of the challenges facing English colonists in the New World. Unlike Ralph Lane, whose military background had shaped his approach to colonial administration, White understood that successful colonization would require adaptation, cooperation, and above all, patience. The 1587 expedition represented a fundamental shift in English colonial strategy. Rather than establishing a military outpost dependent on regular supply ships, Raleigh and his advisors had decided to create a permanent civilian settlement. The 117 colonists included entire families, skilled craftsmen and farmers, people who brought with them not just the skills necessary for survival, but the social structures needed to build a lasting community. Among the colonists was White's own daughter, Eleanor, and her husband Ananias Dare. Eleanor was pregnant, and the prospect of the first English child being born in the New World added a powerful symbolic dimension to the expedition. The colonists were not just establishing a settlement, they were planting the seeds of a new English society that would grow and flourish in American soil. The voyage across the Atlantic proceeded without major incident, following the now familiar route through the Caribbean. But when the ships reached the Outer Banks in July 1587, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The plan had been to collect the 15 men left by Grenville and then proceed to the Chesapeake Bay, where the new colony would be established in a location thought to be more suitable for permanent settlement. However, the ship's pilot, Simon Fernandez, refused to carry the colonists further north. His motivations remain unclear. He may have been eager to return to the Caribbean for privateering, or he may have genuinely believed that the season was too far advanced for safe navigation to the Chesapeake. Whatever his reasons, the result was that the colonists found themselves deposited on Roanoke Island, the very location where the first colony had failed. The discovery of the abandoned settlement was sobering. The buildings erected by Lane's men had been damaged by weather and neglect, and of Grenville's 15 men there was no sign. The colonists found only the bones of one man, whether English or Native American they could not determine. The fate of the garrison remained a mystery that would never be solved. Despite this inauspicious beginning, the colonists set about repairing the settlement with characteristic English determination. They rebuilt the damaged structures, expanded the fortifications, and began the process of adapting the military outpost into a civilian community. The presence of families changed the character of the settlement in fundamental ways, creating a more complex social structure and a greater sense of permanence. White's experience with the indigenous peoples of the region proved invaluable during these early weeks. Unlike Lane, who had approached Native American relations primarily through a military lens, White understood the importance of diplomacy and cultural sensitivity. His relationship with Manteo, the CROATOAN chief who had remained loyal to the English throughout the difficulties of the first colony, became a cornerstone of the new settlement's survival strategy. The colonists' arrival coincided with a period of significant change in the indigenous political landscape. The violent end of the first colony had created new alliances and enmities among the various tribal groups of the region. Some, like Manteo's people, remained open to cooperation with the English. Others, particularly those who had suffered from the epidemics brought by the first colonists, viewed any English presence as a threat to their survival. One of White's first acts as governor was to formally honour Manteo's loyalty by having him christened as a Christian and naming him Lord of Roanoke. This ceremony, conducted according to English custom, but with careful attention to Native American sensibilities, represented an attempt to create a new form of political relationship between the colonists and the indigenous peoples. Whether such a relationship could have succeeded in the long term remains one of the great what-ifs of American history. The summer of 1587 passed relatively peacefully as the colonists worked to establish their community. They planted crops using a combination of English and Native American techniques, began construction of permanent houses, and slowly adapted to the rhythms of life in their new environment. The presence of women and children created a more normal domestic atmosphere, and the colonists began to develop the social institutions that would be necessary for long-term survival. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter, the first English child born in the New World. The baby was named Virginia, in honour of the Virgin Queen and the land that would be her home. The birth was celebrated throughout the colony as a symbol of hope and permanence, proof that English civilization could take root and flourish in American soil. But even as the colonists celebrated this milestone, they were becoming increasingly aware of their precarious situation. The supplies brought from England would not last indefinitely, and the colony's ability to feed itself remained uncertain. The growing season was already well advanced when they arrived, and their inexperience with local agricultural techniques meant that their first harvest would be modest at best. More troubling was the gradually deteriorating relationship with some of the indigenous tribes. The legacy of Ralph Lane's violent confrontation with Chief Wingina continued to cast a shadow over English-Native American relations. Reports reached the colony of hostile movements among some tribal groups, and there were scattered incidents of violence that suggested the peace might not last. It was in this context that the colonists made a fateful decision. They convinced John White to return to England aboard one of the ships that had brought them to Roanoke Island. White would secure additional supplies and reinforcements, and would return as quickly as possible with everything needed to ensure the colony's survival. The decision made sense from a practical standpoint. White's knowledge of the colony's needs and his relationship with Raleigh made him the logical choice for such a mission. Yet the decision to send the governor away so soon after the colony's establishment revealed the fundamental weakness of the English approach to colonization. The colonists remained psychologically dependent on England, unable to conceive of their settlement as truly independent. They saw themselves not as permanent residents of a new land, but as temporary residents of an English outpost that required regular support from the mother country. White's departure in late August 1587 was marked by ceremony and optimism. The colonists had established a system of signals that would allow them to communicate their status to any returning ship. If they were forced to abandon Roanoke Island, they would carve the name of their destination into a prominent tree. If they were in distress, they would add a Maltese cross to the message. These simple arrangements would take on enormous significance in the years to come. The Atlantic crossing back to England proceeded without incident, but White's arrival in London brought disappointing news. The international situation had changed dramatically while he was away. Philip II of Spain, finally provoked beyond endurance by English privateering and support for Dutch rebels, was preparing a massive invasion fleet, the Spanish Armada, that would attempt to conquer England itself. Queen Elizabeth's government, faced with the greatest military threat in English history, had no resources to spare for colonial ventures. Every ship, every man, every weapon was needed for the defence of the realm. White's pleas for immediate assistance for the Roanoke colony fell on deaf ears. The colonists, so recently planted in American soil, would have to survive on their own, while England fought for its very existence. The great naval battles of 1588 that scattered the Spanish Armada and saved England from invasion were fought while 117 English men, women and children remained isolated on a small island off the coast of North Carolina. The colonists, unaware of the dramatic events unfolding in European waters, waited for supply ships that could not come. As autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, their situation became increasingly desperate. White, meanwhile, struggled with mounting frustration and guilt. He had left his daughter and granddaughter in the wilderness, and his inability to return to them became a source of constant anguish. He wrote letter after letter to potential investors and government officials, pleading for ships and supplies for the colony. But the war with Spain consumed all available resources, and White's appeals were repeatedly denied. Not until 1590 would White finally secure passage back to Virginia, and then only aboard a privateering vessel whose captain was more interested in Spanish prizes than in colonial relief. The 3-year delay would prove fatal to White's hopes of finding his family and the other colonists alive and well. When he finally reached Roanoke Island in August 1590, he would find only empty buildings and a mystery that would endure for centuries. The irony of the situation was not lost on contemporary observers. England's greatest military victory, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, had been achieved at the cost of its first serious attempt at American colonization. The city of Raleigh in Virginia, planned as a permanent English settlement that would grow and prosper, had instead become a victim of the very international conflicts that had motivated its creation. Part 4. The Return. The year 1590 brought both relief and renewed anxiety to John White. The Spanish Armada lay at the bottom of the Atlantic, and England had survived the greatest threat to its independence since the Norman conquest. But for White, the victory felt hollow. Somewhere across the ocean, his daughter Eleanor and granddaughter Virginia Dare waited in a settlement that had received no word from England in 3 years. White's efforts to secure a relief expedition had been hampered not only by the war with Spain, but also by the changing priorities of his patron, Walter Raleigh. The failure of the first colony and the long silence from the second had cooled Raleigh's enthusiasm for American ventures. His attention had turned to other projects, including the search for El Dorado in South America and his responsibilities as a Member of Parliament. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. John Watts, a London merchant with interests in privateering, agreed to carry White to Virginia aboard his ship, the Hopewell. But Watts' primary mission was not colonial relief. He planned to cruise the Caribbean in search of Spanish treasure ships. White would be carried to Roanoke Island, but the ship would not wait long for his return. The arrangement was far from ideal, but White was desperate. He had spent 3 years watching helplessly as the window of opportunity for rescuing the colonists slowly closed. Every month that passed made their survival less likely, and White was tormented by the knowledge that his own family was among those who might already be dead. The voyage began inauspiciously in March 1590, but was delayed by storms and mechanical problems. The Hopewell did not clear English waters until late spring, and then followed the time-consuming route through the Caribbean that allowed Watts to pursue his privateering activities. White, forced to watch as precious time was wasted on what he saw as pointless adventures, grew increasingly frustrated and anxious. The Caribbean leg of the voyage proved both profitable and dangerous. Watt's crew captured several Spanish vessels and seized valuable cargo, but they also engaged in several violent confrontations that cost English lives. By the time the Hopewell finally turned north toward Virginia, White was one of the few original crew members who had not been killed or wounded in action. The approach to the Outer Banks in August 1590 was fraught with difficulty. The treacherous waters that had claimed so many ships over the years nearly added the Hopewell to their toll. The ship ran aground on the shoals, and it took hours of dangerous work to free her. When they finally reached the calmer waters of the Sounds, White was almost sick with anticipation. The first glimpse of Roanoke Island brought both hope and concern. Smoke was visible rising from the interior of the island, suggesting that someone, whether English colonist or Native American, was still present. White's heart raced with the possibility that he might be about to reunite with his daughter and granddaughter after 3 years of separation. The landing party that went ashore on August 18, 1590, exactly 3 years after Virginia Dare's birth, found a settlement that was both familiar and alien. The buildings were still standing, though they showed signs of neglect and weather damage. The defensive palisade had been partially dismantled, and grass and weeds had begun to reclaim the cleared areas. Most significantly, there was no sign of the colonists themselves. White's methodical search of the settlement revealed few clues about what had happened to the colonists. Their personal belongings had been removed, but in an orderly fashion that suggested departure rather than flight. The heavy iron cannon that had been the colony's primary defence had been carefully buried, apparently to prevent rust. Most of the buildings had been stripped of anything useful, but again, this seemed to have been done systematically rather than in haste. The crucial discovery came at the entrance to the settlement. Carved into a wooden post was the word CROATOAN, the name of the island where Manteo's people lived, about 50 miles south of Roanoke. There was no Maltese cross accompanying the message, which according to the prearranged signals meant that the colonists were not in distress when they left the message. The implication was clear. The colonists had relocated to CROATOAN Island, probably with the assistance of Manteo and his people. White felt a surge of relief and hope. If the colonists were with friendly Native Americans, they might have survived the 3-year isolation. Virginia Dare would now be a 3-year-old child, probably speaking both English and Algonquian, raised in a unique fusion of European and Native American cultures. But White's relief was short-lived. When he returned to the Hopewell and requested passage to CROATOAN Island, he encountered the harsh realities of his situation. Captain Watts, having already spent more time on the Colonial search than he had planned, was eager to return to the Caribbean and his privateering activities. The weather was deteriorating, and the dangerous waters around CROATOAN Island posed a significant risk to the ship. The debate that followed was agonizing for White. He pleaded with Watts to make the short voyage to CROATOAN Island, arguing that they were so close to solving the mystery of the lost colony. Watts, however, was responsible for his ship and crew, and he was unwilling to risk them for what might prove to be a futile search. The final decision was made by the weather itself. A storm arose that forced the Hopewell to cut her anchor cables and flee to the open ocean. White's last glimpse of the North Carolina coast was through the spray and wind of the storm that carried him away from his family forever. He would never return to Virginia, never learn the fate of his daughter and granddaughter, never know whether the colonists had survived or perished. The man who had documented the New World with such careful precision was forced to leave behind the greatest mystery of his own life. The return voyage to England was bitter for White. He had come so close to solving the riddle of the lost colony, only to be thwarted by weather and the commercial priorities of his transportation. The single word CROATOAN carved into a post became both a hope and a torment. It suggested that the colonists had survived, but it also marked the limit of what he would ever know about their fate. White's report of his findings, submitted to Walter Raleigh upon his return to England, was carefully factual but tinged with personal anguish. He described the orderly abandonment of the settlement, the absence of any signs of violence or distress, and the clear indication that the colonists had gone to CROATOAN Island. But he also conveyed his frustration at being unable to complete the search and his fears about what 3 years of isolation might have done to the colonists' chances of survival. Raleigh's response to White's report was notably restrained. The great promoter of English colonisation, who had invested a fortune in the Virginia ventures, seemed to accept the loss of the colony with resignation. He made no immediate plans for another expedition to search for the colonists, and gradually his interests shifted to other projects. The Roanoke colony, once the centrepiece of his American ambitions, became merely another unsuccessful venture in a career marked by both triumph and failure. The abandonment of the search for the lost colonists reflected broader changes in English colonial policy. The long war with Spain had exhausted the resources available for overseas ventures, and the focus of English expansion was shifting toward other regions. The East India Company, founded in 1600, would channel English energy toward Asia, while the successful establishment of Jamestown in 1607 would mark the beginning of permanent English colonization in North America. But the mystery of the lost colony would not be so easily forgotten. The 117 men, women and children who had vanished into the American wilderness had become part of the mythology of English colonization. Their fate would be debated by historians, investigated by archaeologists, and mythologized by writers for centuries to come. The word CROATOAN would become one of the most famous clues in American history, pointing toward an answer that remained tantalizingly out of reach. John White himself would live for several more years after his return from Virginia, but he never again attempted to reach the lost colony. His final years were spent in relative obscurity, and he died sometime before 1593, taking with him the last direct link to the colonists he had left behind. His detailed drawings and maps of the Roanoke region would survive as invaluable historical documents, but his personal tragedy, the loss of his family in the American wilderness, would remain forever unresolved. The storm that had prevented White from reaching CROATOAN Island in 1590 had created one of history's most enduring mysteries. Had he been able to complete that final 50-mile journey, the fate of the lost colony might have been definitively determined. Instead, the colonists passed from history into legend, their story becoming a haunting reminder of the dangers and uncertainties that faced all who ventured into the unknown territories of the New World. As the 16th century drew to a close, the North Carolina coast returned to its ancient rhythms. The CROATOAN, CROATOAN, and other indigenous peoples continued their seasonal migrations and traditional ways of life, their communities forever changed by their brief encounter with English colonization. The abandoned settlement on Roanoke Island slowly returned to wilderness, its wooden buildings succumbing to weather and time, its cleared fields reclaimed by the forest. But somewhere in the vast expanse of the American continent, the mystery of the lost colony lived on. Whether the colonists had survived and integrated into Native American communities, whether they had perished from disease or violence, or whether they had found some other fate entirely remained unknown. The single word carved into a post, CROATOAN, would echo through the centuries, a tantalizing clue that promised answers but delivered only more questions. Part 5. Echoes and Whispers. The early years of the 17th century brought new English attempts at colonization to the North American coast, but the spectre of the lost colony haunted every new venture. When the Virginia Company established Jamestown in 1607, one of their secondary objectives was to search for any survivors of the Roanoke settlements. The possibility that English colonists might still be living somewhere in the Virginia wilderness added urgency to what was already a desperate struggle for survival. Captain John Smith, the famously energetic leader of the Jamestown colony, made the search for the lost colonists one of his priorities. His explorations of the Chesapeake Bay region and his contacts with local Native American tribes yielded tantalizing hints, but no definitive answers. Some indigenous peoples spoke of white men living among tribes to the south, but these reports were often vague and contradictory. Smith's own accounts, coloured by his tendency toward dramatic exaggeration, added to the mystery rather than solving it. The most intriguing lead came from Powhatan, the powerful chief who controlled much of the Virginia Tidewater region. In conversations with Smith and other English colonists, Powhatan made references to having killed English settlers at a place called Roanoke. When pressed for details, he spoke of a massacre that had occurred some years earlier, describing how his warriors had attacked and destroyed an English settlement. Powhatan's account, if accurate, suggested a violent end to at least some of the lost colonists, but the details he provided were inconsistent and sometimes contradictory. Some scholars have argued that Powhatan may have been referring to the members of Grenville's garrison, the 15 men who had been left on Roanoke Island in 1586. Others have suggested that he was deliberately misleading the English, perhaps to discourage further colonial ventures in his territory. The confusion surrounding Powhatan's statements reflects a broader problem that would plague investigations into the lost colony for centuries. The difficulty of separating reliable information from rumour, speculation, and deliberate misinformation. The oral traditions of indigenous peoples contained valuable historical information, but they were filtered through cultural differences, language barriers, and the political tensions between Native Americans and English colonists. As the Jamestown colony struggled to survive its own challenges, the search for the lost colonists gradually became a lower priority. The immediate demands of finding food, fighting disease, and defending against attack left little time or energy for historical investigations. The mystery of Roanoke became a fascinating footnote to the more pressing concerns of colonial survival. But the story of the lost colony refused to disappear entirely. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, travellers and explorers in the Carolina region reported encounters with Native Americans who claimed descent from English colonists. These accounts, often third-hand and embellished in the telling, described indigenous peoples with European features, English surnames, and knowledge of Christian prayers. One of the most persistent of these stories concerned the Lumbee people of southeastern North Carolina. For generations, members of this community claimed that their ancestors included survivors of the lost colony who had intermarried with local Native Americans. The Lumbee pointed to family names that appeared in the records of the 1587 colony, to physical characteristics that seemed European, and to oral traditions that spoke of white ancestors who had come from the water. Similar claims were made by other indigenous communities throughout the region. The Hatteras people of the Outer Banks, the descendants of the CROATOAN tribe that had befriended the English colonists, maintained that some of their ancestors had been English. Archaeological evidence from Hatteras Island has yielded artefacts that may support these claims, including European-style pottery and metalwork that dates to the late 16th century. The challenge facing historians and archaeologists was distinguishing between legitimate historical evidence and the natural human tendency to create connections with dramatic historical events. The lost colony had captured the popular imagination, and many communities found it attractive to claim descent from these vanished English settlers. Separating fact from fiction required careful analysis of genealogical records, archaeological evidence, and oral traditions. The 19th century brought new attention to the mystery of the lost colony, as American nationalism sought to identify foundational stories that could compete with the established narratives of Plymouth Rock and Jamestown. The tale of the lost colonists, with its elements of mystery, tragedy, and frontier adventure, proved irresistible to writers and historians seeking to create a distinctly American mythology. It was during this period that Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, became a symbol of American origins. Her story was romanticized in poems, novels, and plays that portrayed her as everything from an innocent victim of savage wilderness to a heroic figure who had helped establish the first successful integration of English and Native American cultures. These romanticized accounts, while historically questionable, helped ensure that the lost colony remained a vital part of American cultural memory. The search for physical evidence of the lost colony intensified in the 20th century as archaeological techniques became more sophisticated. Excavations on Roanoke Island, beginning in the 1940s, uncovered the remains of the original settlement and confirmed many details from the historical accounts. The fort described in the colonists' writings was located and partially excavated, revealing artifacts that provided new insights into daily life in the colony. But the most significant archaeological discoveries came from sites away from Roanoke Island itself. Excavations on Hatteras Island, the modern name for CROATOAN Island, have yielded evidence of sustained contact between English colonists and indigenous peoples during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. European artifacts found in Native American contexts suggest that some form of cultural exchange, and possibly intermarriage, may indeed have occurred. The Hatteras excavations have revealed a complex pattern of cultural interaction that supports some of the traditional claims about the lost colonists' fate. Native American sites from this period contain unusually large quantities of European materials, including copper, iron, and glass objects, that appear to have been obtained through trade or other peaceful means. More intriguingly, some of these artifacts show evidence of having been reworked using Native American techniques, suggesting a sustained period of cultural blending. Recent archaeological work has also focused on the mainland, particularly in areas where 16th century maps indicated the presence of Native American settlements. The theory that the lost colonists may have relocated to the mainland, either voluntarily or as captives, has gained credibility as researchers have uncovered evidence of European presence in inland areas during the appropriate time period. One of the most promising recent discoveries came from a site near the modern town of Buxton, North Carolina, where archaeologists have found evidence of a European-style workshop dating to the late 16th century. The site contains the remains of what appears to have been a forge or metalworking facility, along with tools and materials that suggest sustained European activity. Whether this represents the work of lost colonists or some other European presence remains to be determined. The scientific analysis of these archaeological finds has been complicated by the passage of time and the limitations of 16th century record keeping. Many of the artifacts that might provide definitive evidence of the lost colonists' fate are similar to materials that could have been left by later European visitors to the region. Distinguishing between objects that date to the 1580s and those from the early 1600s requires sophisticated dating techniques that are not always conclusive. Genetic studies of modern populations have added another dimension to the investigation. DNA analysis of Native American communities that claim descent from the lost colonists has provided some intriguing results, though the evidence remains inconclusive. The genetic signatures of European ancestry are present in many indigenous populations, but determining whether this ancestry dates to the 16th century or to later periods of contact is extremely difficult. The Lumbee people in particular have been the subject of extensive genetic studies. While these studies have confirmed the presence of European ancestry in the community, they have not been able to definitively link this ancestry to the lost colonists. The complex history of European Native American interaction in the region makes it impossible to determine whether European genetic markers date to the 1580s or to subsequent centuries. As the 21st century progresses, new technologies continue to offer hope for solving the mystery of the lost colony. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and other remote sensing techniques have enabled archaeologists to identify potential sites for investigation, without the expense and disruption of full-scale excavations. These tools have already identified several promising locations that may contain evidence of the lost colonists' fate. The enduring fascination with the lost colony reflects something deeper than simple historical curiosity. The story of the 117 colonists who vanished into the American wilderness touches on fundamental questions about identity, survival, and the nature of cultural contact. Their fate remains a mystery that continues to resonate with contemporary audiences, a reminder that even in our age of global communication and surveillance, it is still possible for people to simply disappear. Part 6. The Enduring Mystery. The soft light of dawn breaks over the Outer Banks, much as it did more than 4 centuries ago when John White first glimpsed the coast of what would become North Carolina. The waters that once carried English ships still wash against the same barrier islands, but the land they touch has been transformed by centuries of human activity. Where once stood the modest wooden buildings of the lost colony, only archaeological trenches and historical markers remain to tell the story of America's first great mystery. Today, the search for the lost colonists continues with methods that would have seemed like magic to John White and his contemporaries. Archaeologists armed with metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and sophisticated dating techniques probe the Carolina soil for traces of the vanished settlement. Geneticists analyze DNA samples from modern populations, searching for molecular evidence of 16th century European ancestry. Historians pore over newly discovered documents, hoping to find the clue that will finally solve the 4-century-old puzzle. The most recent archaeological investigations have focused on a site near Buxton, North Carolina, where researchers believe they may have found evidence of a European presence dating to the late 16th century. The discovery of what appears to be a metalworking facility, along with tools and materials consistent with English colonial technology, has generated considerable excitement among researchers. If confirmed, this site could represent the first definitive evidence of lost colonist activity away from Roanoke Island. But even as new evidence emerges, the fundamental questions about the lost colony remain unanswered. Did the colonists survive their abandonment on Roanoke Island? If so, what became of them? Did they integrate into Native American communities, establish their own settlement elsewhere, or meet some other fate entirely? The single word CROATOAN, carved into a post in 1590, continues to tantalize researchers, pointing toward an answer that remains just beyond reach. The various theories about the colonists' fate reflect the complexity of the historical and archaeological evidence. The integration theory, supported by some genetic and archaeological evidence, suggests that the colonists relocated to CROATOAN Island and gradually intermarried with the indigenous population. This theory is consistent with the CROATOAN message and with the friendly relationship that had existed between some colonists and Manteo's people. The massacre theory, based primarily on Chief Powhatan's statements to the Jamestown colonists, argues that the lost colonists were killed by hostile Native Americans, possibly after attempting to relocate to the mainland. This theory explains the colonists' disappearance, but leaves little hope for descendants or archaeological evidence of their survival. The dispersal theory suggests that the colonists scattered into small groups, with some integrating into Native American communities, while others established independent settlements that gradually failed or were absorbed by later European colonization. This theory accounts for the various reports of European-descended Native Americans throughout the region, while acknowledging that no single community can claim to represent the lost colony's complete legacy. Each of these theories has its adherents among scholars, and each is supported by some evidence while being contradicted by other findings. The truth may involve elements of all 3 scenarios, reflecting the complex realities of survival in the 16th century American wilderness. The colonists may have initially relocated to CROATOAN Island, then dispersed to various mainland locations, with different groups meeting different fates. The indigenous peoples of the region, whose ancestors witnessed the arrival and disappearance of the English colonists, have their own perspectives on the mystery. The oral traditions of the Lumbee, Hatteras, and other communities preserve stories of English ancestors and cultural interactions that may contain valuable historical information. These traditions, while sometimes difficult to verify through conventional historical methods, represent an important source of knowledge about the colonial period. Modern DNA analysis has added a new dimension to these traditional claims. Studies of Native American populations in the Carolina region have identified genetic markers consistent with European ancestry, though determining the precise timing and source of this ancestry remains challenging. The presence of European genetic material in indigenous populations is not surprising, given centuries of contact and intermarriage, but some patterns may be consistent with 16th century origins. The scientific investigation of the lost colony has been hampered by the passage of time and the limitations of available evidence. 4 centuries of weather, development, and natural processes have obscured or destroyed much of the archaeological record. Many of the artifacts that might provide definitive answers have been lost to erosion, decay, or simple displacement. The organic materials that might yield the most precise dating information, wood, leather, textiles, are rarely preserved in the acidic soils of the Carolina coast. Despite these challenges, new discoveries continue to emerge. In 2020, archaeologists announced the discovery of what may be a 16th century European settlement on the mainland near the modern town of Edenton, North Carolina. The site, located in an area shown on John White's maps as containing Native American villages, has yielded artifacts that appear to be of European origin and date to the appropriate time period. The Edenton site represents a new approach to lost colony research, one that focuses on the mainland rather than the barrier islands where the original settlement was located. This approach is based on the recognition that the colonists, faced with the challenges of survival on Roanoke Island, would likely have sought more hospitable locations with better access to fresh water, fertile soil, and friendly indigenous populations. The investigation of potential lost colony sites has been aided by advances in remote sensing technology. Satellite imagery and aerial photography have revealed landscape features that may be associated with 16th century European activity. Ground-penetrating radar has enabled archaeologists to identify subsurface features without the expense and disruption of full-scale excavations. These technologies have dramatically expanded the scope of lost colony research, allowing investigators to survey large areas efficiently. The search for the lost colony has also benefited from interdisciplinary collaboration. Historians, archaeologists, geneticists, and specialists in Native American studies have worked together to develop new approaches to old questions. This collaboration has led to a more nuanced understanding of the colonial period and the complex interactions between European and indigenous peoples. One of the most important developments in lost colony research has been the recognition that the colonists' fate cannot be understood in isolation from the broader context of European colonization and indigenous resistance. The lost colony was not simply a group of people who disappeared. It was part of a larger pattern of cultural contact, conflict, and adaptation that shaped the early history of North America. The indigenous peoples of the Carolina region were not passive recipients of European colonization, but active participants in a complex process of cultural negotiation. Their decisions about whether to cooperate with, resist, or accommodate the English colonists were based on their own political and economic interests, as well as their understanding of the long-term implications of European presence in their territory. This broader perspective has led to a more sophisticated understanding of what survival might have meant for the lost colonists. Rather than simply asking whether they lived or died, researchers now ask how they might have adapted to their new circumstances, what kinds of communities they might have formed, and how their descendants might have integrated into the complex cultural landscape of colonial America. The mystery of the lost colony continues to resonate with contemporary audiences because it addresses fundamental questions about identity, survival, and the nature of cultural contact. In an age of global communication and constant connectivity, the idea that an entire community could simply vanish seems almost impossible. Yet the lost colony reminds us that such disappearances were once common, and that the survival of European settlements in the New World was far from guaranteed. The story of the lost colony also raises important questions about how we remember and interpret the past. The colonists who disappeared into the American wilderness left behind no written records of their fate, no monuments to their achievements, no clear legacy for future generations. Their story must be pieced together from fragments of evidence, oral traditions, and archaeological remains. This process of reconstruction is inevitably influenced by the perspectives and assumptions of those who undertake it. The romanticization of the lost colony in American popular culture has created a mythology that sometimes obscures the historical reality. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, has become a symbol of American origins, but the real Virginia Dare was simply one of 117 people who faced the challenges of survival in an unfamiliar environment. Her story is remarkable not because of its symbolic significance, but because of its human dimension, the story of a child born into uncertainty and shaped by circumstances beyond her control. As research into the lost colony continues, new questions emerge even as old ones remain unanswered. The development of increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques promises to yield new insights into the colonists' fate, but it also reveals the limitations of our current understanding. Each new discovery adds complexity to the story rather than simplifying it, suggesting that the truth about the lost colony may be more nuanced and multifaceted than previous generations of researchers assumed. The ongoing investigation of the lost colony reflects broader changes in how we approach historical questions. Modern researchers are more likely to consider multiple perspectives, to acknowledge the limitations of available evidence, and to recognize that historical truth may be more complex and ambiguous than previous generations assumed. The lost colony, in this sense, serves as a case study in the challenges and opportunities of historical investigation. The waters of the Outer Banks continue their eternal rhythm, carrying away the sands that once supported the wooden buildings of the lost colony. The barrier islands shift and change, shaped by storms and tides that follow patterns older than human memory. Yet somewhere beneath the surface, in the archaeological record and the genetic heritage of modern populations, the story of the lost colonists continues to unfold. The mystery of the lost colony may never be completely solved. The passage of time, the limitations of available evidence, and the complexity of the historical record may forever prevent us from knowing with certainty what became of the 117 men, women and children who vanished into the American wilderness. But the search itself continues to yield valuable insights into the nature of early American colonization and the complex interactions between European and indigenous peoples. In the end, the lost colony of Roanoke stands as a reminder of the fragility of human settlements and the courage of those who ventured into the unknown. Whether the colonists survived to establish new communities, perished in the wilderness, or found some other fate entirely, their story represents a fundamental chapter in the American experience, the story of people who left everything behind in search of new possibilities, who faced the challenges of survival in an unfamiliar land, and who ultimately became part of the vast and complex history of North America. As the sun sets over the Outer Banks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the mystery of the lost colony settles into the landscape like morning mist. The search continues, driven by the same human curiosity and determination that once carried English ships across the Atlantic. Somewhere in the Carolina wilderness, in the genetic heritage of modern populations, or in the archaeological record that awaits discovery, the lost colonists may yet yield their secrets. Until then, they remain what they have always been, a haunting reminder of the mysteries that lie buried in the American past, waiting to be discovered by those bold enough to seek them out.